Welcome to part 17 of the Intermediate Revit course. We're going to do a complete overview of the Enscape settings inside of Revit so that we can do a complete interior render, which is going to look really nice. If you'd like to get access to all of the course files, materials, and resources, as well as 4 hours of ad-free content, you can feel free to check out the full course on my website. I'll see you there. Alright, so once you're happy with all of the materials assigned to things in this view and you've got all your furniture in place, what we can do is change our render settings and render this out. So what I'm going to do is render this out in Enscape. The reason why I'm doing that is because it's just the fastest and easiest way to do renders, and it's what a lot of practices use in the real world, being able to produce drawings from a working model like this in literally no time at all. It's real time. Whereas you can get a lot nicer renders using things like V-Ray or Lumion. This is really the industry standard at the moment. You'll never really see architecture firms using V-Ray or Lumion or anything like that unless they are outsourcing their rendering to a actual architecture visualizer. That's because it does take multiple hours up to a day to produce just one single render. So if they're doing a big project, they might hire someone for a day to do a render for a couple $100, but most of the time they'll do their working renders using Enscape. So what we're going to do is go to the Enscape tab. We're going to start our render. And then once that's started, I've got it opened here. We're going to want to change our settings, and we can do that by not pressing this gear icon like you'd think. This is just the Windows settings. If we open that up, you can see that this is just really working settings, I guess you could say, mouse speed, the height reference of the person. So if you wanted to change the height of the person, you can change it here. 1.68 is pretty standard. And then you can also change some devices and sound stuff, but we don't want to touch any of that. We want to change the actual visual settings. So I'm going to go to the left one here with the eye and click on visual settings. This is going to bring up this screen here. And this is where we have control of what the render is going to look like. Now, the first thing that we want to change is the rendering quality. If this is just a test render, which is what we're going to do first, we can probably set this down to medium. And you're going to see that that changes the view as well. So you can see that it's now on medium rendering. This is what it looks like when you're using the draft rendering settings, but I think we'll probably keep it on medium for now, and then we can change it to the ultra settings once we do our final render. So that's one thing to note when you're just doing test renders. Rather than having to wait 5 minutes for your render, just set it down to draft or medium, and you can change the lighting settings and stuff like that. So at the moment you can see that it is rather overexposed out this side here, and in the image that we're referencing, it's not that exposed. So this is mainly due to there not being any kind of buildings or anything surrounding the site. What we can do is actually just change the exposure settings manually rather than doing auto exposure. So if we untick that, you can see that that's already adjusted the exposure so that it's now got the focus out in these windows here. And a good, I guess, tip for doing any kind of renders or photography is that you never really want the camera to be facing a light source like this. You always want the light source to be on the side you're taking the photo from or taking the render from, because then you'll have really nice lighting, which is natural lighting on the other side. But because we've got this big window here as well, probably not a big deal. We can change the exposure manually, and we can also change the field of view. And the field of view options pretty much just zooming in and out. And the further you zoom in, the better high quality detail you have. But the more you zoom out, the more distortion there's going to be, and it's going to be more of a fisheye effect. But most of the time I can just keep this on 90 and it'll do the trick. Now, depth of field is going to add a blur behind or in front of anything that is not in the focus. So like a camera, if you're using your iPhone or your Android phone or whatever you're doing, and what you can do is actually focus on a specific object. So we could focus on the jukebox here, and then everything else in the background is going to be blurred. So if we bring this up, you can see that in action. There's currently a blur coming out here, but everything in here is in focus. And so we might actually want something like this. What you can do is just tick autofocus, or what you can do is change the focal point, and you can see it here now. The focal point is going to be in line with this, but then everything else is going to be blurred. I don't usually use depth of field too much. It can, give some cool effects, but for us, it's not really necessary. So I'm just going to change the depth of field back to 0, and that's going to turn that off. So you can manually change the exposure, and we can turn it down, which darkens the image, or we can turn it up, which brightens the image. And again, you don't really want to play with this inside of Enscape auto exposure usually does the best job, and you can see it's overexposed outside, but what we can do is change this in Photoshop later. So if we come over to the image tab, you can see that you've then got corrections. So if you wanted to, you could turn down the highlights, and what this is going to do is turn down those really high overexposed spots. But then also what you're doing is removing some detail as well. So usually, again, don't want to play with these too much inside of Enscape unless you are just doing quick renders. But if we are going to edit this out in Photoshop as well, we're going to have control over all of this anyways, and it's going to be much easier and much more efficient doing it in Photoshop. Again, color temperature going down to the lower kelvins. This is going to make it more yellow. And then coming over to the other side, it's going to make it more blue. Usually around the middle is the color of daylight. 6600 is a pretty good color temperature. Again, we can change the color settings in Photoshop, so don't worry too much about that. Now, I won't usually put any effects on it as well. There's probably not much point, but you can have a play around with that. For the atmosphere, again, don't need to change too much in like fog or the wind, but you can change the sun brightness, because if we turn this up, you're going to see it, get brighter. So this is another way of changing the lighting settings. If we turn it all the way down, you can see that there is now no sun. And what's lighting the scene now is the ambient brightness. So if we were to turn this up, you can see that it doesn't have too much effect. If you have a look at the carpet, you can see it slightly gets a bit brighter. Usually I'll leave that on 50%. The sun brightness, I do play around with this quite often, and you can adjust what it looks like. And then if you wanted to adjust if there were lights on inside, you can adjust that with the artificial light brightness, but they are not actual lights, they're just families. If we go to the sky settings, you can also set a background or a sky box for what's surrounding it. I do sometimes like to do this. You can see here, skybox, you can then load your own file. So if you wanted to, you could load in a HDRI file of a sky or a background that you'd like, or you can use one of the preset ones that is inside of Enscape. So for example, I could make this town, and then you're going to see if we go outside, there is now a HDRI map on the horizon line, which is pretty cool, just to give it a bit more detail, make it look a little bit more realistic. What we can also do is change the rotation of that if we wanted to. This is where you control the sky, so you can control the density of the clouds and how much there is. So if you want it to be a really nice day, you can turn down the density and then it'll make the sky bluer. Really, what we just need to do is now change the output settings. This is probably the most important part. So there isn't much to this, but what you want to know is the resolution. Choose, Ultra HD, which is going to make this a 4K image, or you can make this full HD, which is going to be 1080p, and then HD 720p, and so forth. What we want to do is first figure out what we're going to use this render for. So if you're using this on your actual presentation sheet, what you want to do is sketch out a plan of your sheet to see whereabouts this is going to go, and then decide how big it's going to be on your page. What you also need to consider is if this is going to be printed out or if it's just going to be on the screen, because if it's getting printed, the resolution is going to need to be much higher than if it's just going on the screen and you're using it for a PDF or something like that, or your website. What we can also do is change this to custom, and then we can make this, say if we wanted it to be a square, we can make an aspect ratio of 1. Then when we render this out, it's going to be a square and it's going to cut off the sides. So I'm just going to use the preset. I'm going to make this full HD, and I'm also going to want to export out the object ID, material ID, and depth channel, because what this does is it allows us to select different objects and materials from inside Photoshop, and it's going to give each material and each object a different color, which we can then use the magic wand tool to select inside of Photoshop. It's a way to make the post-production process much, much easier. And the depth channel, we can use this to create an alpha channel. And I'm actually going to do this, and I'm going to set the depth range to something really far out. So then we can use this to get an alpha channel. The file format, usually PNG is fine. You can also use JPEG or one of these other files if you have experience with doing so. And now we're just going to choose the location where this is going to go, and then we can render this out. What we want to do is move the position of the screen into place where we want the render to be taken from. And one final setting we can also change is where the sun is placed. At the moment, it seems like the sun is coming in from this side over here and is then coming in through the building like that. What we can do is hold down Shift and then use the right mouse button and drag across from the right to left or from the left to right. And this is going to change the sun position, and you can see in the bottom right corner, there is the time of day. So at the moment, this is now, 6 o'clock, nighttime. You can see that the sun's coming in at about 4 p.m. or you can make it morning time by going over to the other side. Now it's 9 a.m. The sun is not as strong. What I like to do is set this so that it's just slightly coming in through the building. Might want some light rays coming in from this side, and that looks pretty good, but have a play around with that. And then once this is in the right position, we can then hit the render button and do a test render. So to do our test render, we're going to come up to the top here, press this button up here, which is screenshot. Again, you're gonna have to choose a spot where it goes, save it. Let's open this up and see what it looks like then. This is going to render it out. If we go find where that was, there you can see our render. This is, pretty good for a basic render. You can see the couch material isn't quite right, and the materials on the TV aren't right. And this is something we're going to be changing in post-production. Also, the lighting is something that I want to touch in Photoshop as well. What's cool is that if we go to the next one, here's the alpha channel. So anything in black is going to be out in the distance. And then if we go across one more, you can see that everything in the image has a color assigned to it. So then if we wanted to just edit this little side thing, rather than trying to use the lasso tool in Photoshop to select it, we can just come over and use our material ID, use the magic wand tool and select this color. Makes it super easy, and that's also the same for objects, which is pretty similar really, but then you can select some other things as well. So now that we're happy with that, I'm going to do a high quality render. I'm going to go to the visual settings again and go to the main tab and then change the rendering quality to ultra. What you can do is screenshot that one more time. I'm going to make a new folder for this and call this final interior render. All right, so there's our render. That looks really nice. It's photorealistic, which is what we wanted. If we go back to the original image, you can see that very, very similar, which is pretty cool. So now what we just need to do is bring this into Photoshop and make some adjustments. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how you can change the sun settings inside of Revit, which will ultimately change them in Enscape as well. If you'd like to get access to all of the course files, materials, and resources, as well as 4 hours of ad-free content, you can feel free to check out the full course on my website. I'll see you there.